Thank you very much. And on behalf of Asialink, it's a great honour to welcome Malcolm Turnbull, who joins us tonight. In introducing Malcolm Turnbull, there are so many facets of a remarkable career that we could mention. But for me, what stands out is a willingness to take policy as a serious project and one to be approached through principle. And I first saw that in the 1990s when Malcolm Turnbull threw his energy and his leadership into making Australia a republic. Sadly, a little like the French rugby team at this year's World Cup, a heroic fight didn't quite produce the result expected when tested at a referendum in November 1999. But for me, it was seeing that determination and that sheer guts of having a go that really marked Malcolm out. I had the great fortune to work in a small capacity alongside him in that venture, and I remain deeply impressed by the completely selfless way he threw himself at the task and the leadership he provided at that moment. And I saw that same leadership more recently, that willingness to go against the grain, when, as leader of the Australian Liberal Party, Malcolm took a principled stand on a vital but contentious topic of Australia's response to climate change, a stand that, a little like the Republican movement in the 1990s, didn't quite get there. But it showed the character of the man, it showed the willingness to do what he felt was right. It built on a significant set of achievements as the Minister for Environment and Water Resources in the Howard government. It showed that Malcolm Turnbull is someone who thinks deeply about what he does. He thinks deeply about Australia's place in the world, how we should conduct ourselves as a polity and a nation. So it's a great pleasure to call on Malcolm Turnbull to deliver tonight's keynote address and to launch the PwC Melbourne Institute Asialink Index. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, the Federal Member for Wentworth, the Shadow Minister for Communications and Broadband, Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, thank you, Glyn, for so eloquently chronicling my defeats. You know, I'm reminded of the Baron Cambronne, who commanded the Emperor's Guard at Waterloo, who, when called upon to surrender, so it was said to the British, "Le garde meurt mais ne se rend pas." The old guard dies but never surrenders. Very noble thing to say, faced with certain defeat, although subsequently he said at a dinner in Paris that what he'd actually said was mad. Glorious defeats. Well, we don't want any more of them, I can tell you. Now, it is a great honour to deliver this year's Sir Edward Weary Dunlop Lecture, named for one of the greatest Australians, a man whose indomitable courage and humanity in the face of the cruellest adversity was only exceeded by his love for all mankind that enabled him to reach across the bitter memories of war and build again our friendship with foes and friends alike. And it's a pleasure too to launch tonight the 2011 PwC Melbourne Institute Asialink Index, which for the past 4 years has been in the tricky business of providing objective measurements of changes in one of our nation's ethereal yet critically important assets, the vast web of personal, political, economic and cultural ties which join Australia and our neighbours. I'll come back to the index in a moment, but first let me acknowledge the Meyer family, including Balliol Meyer, Sid Meyer, Lady Marigold Southey and the Meyer Foundation, whose collective support for Asialink and the local arm of the Asia Society is just part of a broader commitment to philanthropy in the national interest that spans 75 years. Glyn Davis, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne and the Meyer Foundation's partner in Asialink. Mr Richard Woolcott, one of Australia's, well, I'd say not one of Australia's most experienced and distinguished diplomat, and of course the other very distinguished members of the diplomatic corps here tonight. The Honourable John Brumby, former Premier of Victoria, my colleagues and friends, Kelly O'Dwyer, the member for Higgins, and Josh Frydenberg, the member for Kooyong, and of course the winner of the 2011 Dunlop Medal, Geraldine Cox. The most important message from this year's Asialink Index is that during the difficult economic conditions of the past few years, the two-way engagement between Australia and Asia held up much better than our equivalent ties with the rest of the world, which of course includes our traditionally most important bilateral relationships. Much of what drives the Asialink Index are direct economic linkages. Trade, cross-border investment, research and business development are 3 of the 7 areas it tracks. And as we all appreciate, the economies of the Asia-Pacific showed far greater resilience than those of the North Atlantic during the global financial crisis, so perhaps this isn't a surprise. It's worth noting, however, that since the onset of the crisis, some economic indicators of mutual engagement have faltered. For example, investment from Asia into Australia fell sharply in 2010. But there has been a broadly offsetting strengthening of ties in the form of education exchanges, the flow of tourists and flow of migrants, where India and China are now 2 of our 3 largest source countries. There are more individually driven personal activities where ties are formed or deepened by vast numbers of face-to-face encounters, and in the long run are surely just as important as trade or investment in helping people in different countries better understand each other. So the Asialink Index underlines that engagement with Asia is no longer mainly a matter for business. It's everybody's business, in fact. A corollary is that the far more diverse multicultural Australia that has emerged over the past 2 generations, as we've drawn closer to the region, is itself becoming one of our greatest competitive advantages. Just as similarly diverse societies over history have always gained an edge from their bringing together of varied cultures and contending ideas. And when you look around the world today, think of the cities and societies that for one reason or other have become less diverse. And as you reflect on that, whether it is Constantinople, Istanbul, Smyrna, Alexandria, think of those places, and there are many others, that have become less diverse, and you'll reflect that they have become less dynamic, less prosperous, less strong, less inviting. The Victorian Premier, Ted Baillieu, highlights this in his excellent contribution to this year's report, where he notes that Fortune magazine ranked Melbourne as one of the world's 15 best new cities for business, in part because of this very factor of diversity. And to quote Ted, "Connectivity is vital. One reason Fortune singled Melbourne out is our diverse labour pool," pointing out that about 1/3 of Melbourne's growing population was born overseas. In other words, our multiculturalism gives us a head start. Well said. My final comment about the Asialink Index is that much of its value is in the broad sweep of what it says about the 2 decades that its data covers, rather than the ups and downs from year to year. This year's publication tells us that between 1990 and 2010, Australia-Asia trade increased almost 4-fold in real terms, tourist volumes rose 4-fold, annual investment flows 5-fold, and education movements more than 6-fold. Over those 20 years, our society and economy have been transformed as a result, perhaps not as dramatically as parts of Asia, but in fundamental and largely beneficial ways. Now, last month, I offered the London School of Economics a view from Australia on the rise of Asia, entitled "Same Bed, Different Dreams." A delightfully cynical Chinese phrase, which I'll render imperfectly, tong chong yi mong, which describes the awkwardness of intimacy without empathy, as unsatisfying politically as it is, no doubt, domestically. It was a long paper, more suited for a university lecture hall than a congenial dinner like this, but its theme was very appropriate for this occasion, for one of the great inspirations from Weary Dunlop's life was his ability to see the common humanity of all people and to empathise with those from other nations and other cultures. Now, my contention is that we have vastly more to gain than to lose from the rise of China, India, and the rest of emerging Asia. There are risks and threats, to be sure, but they are greatly outweighed by the opportunities. And before proceeding to speak mainly about China, and also, to a lesser extent, India, let me simply note that our varied region includes other large, dynamic emerging markets, such as Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and sophisticated industrial economies, such as South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and of course, Japan, the great economy, the developed nation, the long-term developed nation of Asia, that over the past 2 decades have become, or continued to be in Japan's case, as productive and prosperous as the advanced nations of the Northern Hemisphere, or indeed the North Atlantic. Their stories and their futures are just as fascinating and important to us as those of China and India. Now, our response to this extraordinary economic change, the rise of China, closely followed by India, and it is the most profound in our lifetimes, must be clear-eyed and founded on facts, not ideology, let alone paranoia. We must recognise that the world is changing dramatically. Just consider this. 30 years ago, China was barely open to the world at all. Since then, its economy has grown 18-fold, an annual average of 10%. India's GDP has grown 6-fold in that time, an average annual rate of 6%, partly reflecting the fact that its economic takeoff started more than a decade after Deng Xiaoping commenced the economic reform process in China in 1979. China is now the world's second largest economy and will overtake the United States in 2016, according to the IMF. Some analysts argue it has already done so. And India has this year passed Japan to become the 3rd largest economy measured in purchasing power terms. Demography is indeed destiny. In 1990, the old industrial powers in North America and Western Europe produced about half of global GDP. By 2030, their share will decline to a quarter. Emerging Asia, ex-Japan, produced 14% of world GDP in 1990, but by 2030 its share will triple to 44%, with 3/4 of that generated in China and India. So the old trio of the United States, Japan and Western Europe, which used to drive the global economy, is giving way to a new one, the US, China and India. Forecasting is always perilous, but we can reasonably anticipate these will remain the world's 3 largest national economies for many decades. And in talking about forecasting, I'm reminded of Ross Garnaut's memorable phrase that when it comes to China, the pessimists are generally more scholarly, but the optimists are more generally right. The pace and the scale of this shift is unprecedented. There has never been a country as big as China that has grown so fast. It took a much smaller Britain 50 years from 1820 to increase its share of world GDP from 5 to 9%, and the United States more than 40 years after 1870 to increase its share from 9 to 19%. But it's important for us, and this is where I get back to the same bed, different dreams, and recognising that the importance of empathy that goes with intimacy. It is important to remember that from a Chinese or an Indian perspective, this rapid growth in wealth and power is not so much a rise, but a return to the natural order of things. From antiquity until the middle of the 19th century, China and India were the 2 largest global economies, accounting for about half the world's economic output. Their current climb up the GDP rankings restores them to where history and population predicts they should be. But changes in the relative economic position of large and powerful nations are seldom smooth or free from anguish. Americans, in particular, are still struggling to come to grips with the rise of China, which represents an historically unique challenge to the United States. And the post-GFC recession in the United States, where recovery has been sluggish and unemployment is stuck near 9%, has made relative economic performance a hot issue in Washington. Whatever else it may have signalled, President Obama's recent speech in Parliament in Canberra should have left no careful listener in doubt that US domestic politics, especially economic considerations, will be a key shaper of both the content of US policy on China and our region, and even more so, how it is presented. Americans have a deep sense of their own exceptionalism, and since birth have been assured that they will always be the strongest, richest, and indeed cleverest nation on earth. Tom Friedman's latest book, That Used to Be Us, is eloquent testimony to the growing sense of inadequacy Americans feel as they compare their country to China. Its title was inspired by President Obama's remarks in November last year. The President said, and I quote, "It makes no sense," think about that, "it makes no sense for China to have better rail systems than us and Singapore having better airports than us. And we just learned that China now has the fastest supercomputer on earth. That used to be us." It's not just President Obama having a Sputnik moment. Americans everywhere feel the core of their economy is being hollowed out. Their pessimism has a basis. 42,000 factories closed in the United States between 2001 and 2010, 5.5 million manufacturing jobs gone. Median incomes have been stagnant for years, income inequality has worsened, and as we now know all too well, easy credit was a financial palliative, allowing households to continue spending more while their wages were flat. Michael Spence has pointed out that globalization was until recently seen as having a benign impact on the distribution of income in advanced countries, but this is changing. Professor Spence, as the developing countries became larger and richer, their economic structures changed in response to the forces of comparative advantage. They moved up the value-added chain. Now developing countries increasingly produce the kind of high value-added components that 30 years ago were the exclusive purview of advanced economies. This climb is a permanent, irreversible change. Technology exacerbates this problem in two ways. Almost every technological advance reduces the demand for labour, whether it's in accounting and financial functions, logistics, or even unmanned dump trucks and loaders at mine sites in the Pilbara. At the same time, information technology and communications are making more sectors and jobs trade exposed. Many service jobs are becoming globally contestable. Not just call centres, but also financial and legal analysts, programmers, designers, architects. It's a long list. The owner of a frock shop used to think she was competing with the boutique across the road or with Myers. Now she competes with the whole world. Online retailers can fulfil an order made in Melbourne from the other side of the world in 3 or 4 days. So globalisation and technology are economic forces that are far bigger than any one country, even countries as large and powerful as China or the United States. Yet all too often the shifts they are causing in economic power or the competitiveness of particular industries in Western nations are seen as China's fault, the consequence of China not playing fair. And yet advanced economies cannot blame China or indeed the rest of emerging Asia for their own choices. If bridges and roads and subways in our developed country are not in good repair, that is our problem. If our young people are leaving school not only behind their contemporaries in China and Korea, but all too often unable to read and write, then there is another problem for us. Too often we ask ourselves the wrong question: why are we declining relative to China, when we should be asking, why are we not as good as we can be? Now, as Henry Kissinger recently reminded us, history is far from bunk in China. No other country can claim so long a continuous civilization or such an intimate link to its ancient past and classical principles of strategy and statesmanship. And that indeed is why Deng Xiaoping opened China up to the world. In 1979, he invoked the example of the 15th century Admiral Zheng He, who led great voyages across the Indian Ocean. And he was quite a guy. He got to the top of the Chinese hierarchy in those days, and he was a bit of an outsider. He was both a eunuch and a Muslim, so a man of great talent. In those days, an open and confident China was the world's strongest nation. When later emperors closed China off to the world, Deng reminded the hardliners China became weak and began a decline that ended with 150 years of humiliating invasion, colonisation and exploitation by stronger nations. It's important to remember in that context the best description of realpolitik 2,500 years ago in Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars, when Alcibiades and the Athenian ambassadors go to the neutral state of Melos and urge them to come on side with the Athenians. And the Melians say, come on, we just want to be neutral. We don't want to be with you or the Spartans. We want to, be neutral. We just want to, fair's fair. Give us a break. And they spoke about justice. And the Athenians finally brought the discussion to an end and say, come on, spare us your fine words. You know as well as we do that justice in the world is only found between equals in power. As for the rest, the strong do what they will, and the weak suffer as they must. The Chinese have no need to be reminded of Book 5 of the Peloponnesian War. A humiliation that in the 20th century included the brutality of the Japanese occupation, the rape of Nanjing, and in the 19th century, the Opium Wars, which were the equivalent of the Medellin cartel sending a nuclear submarine up the Potomac and threatening successfully to destroy the Capitol and the White House unless the US disbanded the Drug Enforcement Agency. China has drunk deep and long from the well of bitterness and defeat. And so when Mao Zedong announced his triumph from on top of Tiananmen in 1949, his first words were, 中国人民站起来了, that Chinese people have stood up. So it is no surprise that as China becomes richer, it seeks to strengthen its military capacity. Those who interpret this as necessarily meaning a stronger China is a more aggressive one should reflect on China's history and indeed more recent events. China lost in the 19th century vast tracts of land in what is now Siberian Russia, the Amurskaya region, and indeed Vladivostok itself. These seizures or thefts were ratified in unequal treaties in 1858 and 1860. Recognising that a depopulating yet resource-rich Siberia may constitute an opportunity in the future, China could well have decided to leave those treaties as illegitimate artefacts of its century of humiliation, to be redressed when times were more propitious. Instead, it has chosen to renegotiate and settle the Sino-Russian borders with minor adjustments, hardly evidence for imminent territorial expansion. And as Kissinger has also pointed out, unlike the USSR or even the United States, China does not seek to persuade other countries to adopt its values, let alone its system of government. The central role of trade in China's prosperity also argues for its rise to remain peaceful. In 2010, China's trade was 55% of its GDP, the same as for Britain in the 1870s, the era of the Pax Britannica, and 5 times larger than trade in the US economy of the 1950s and 60s, when American economic dominance was greatest. Given the importance of a stable economy and the regime's legitimacy, China's rulers themselves have more to lose than almost anyone from conflict that disturbs global economic flows. The best and most realistic strategic outcome for East Asia must be one in which the powers are in balance, with each side effectively able to deny the domination of the other. a scenario which Hugh White has written about extensively recently. Now, with its energy and resource security depending on long global sea lanes, it's hardly surprising either that China would seek to enhance its naval capacity. Suggestions that China's recent launch of one aircraft carrier and plans to build another as signs of a new belligerence are wide of the mark. In that regard, I disagree with the underlying premise of the 2009 Australian White Paper, that we should base our defence planning and procurement on the contingency of a naval war with China in the South China Sea. Prejudice or wishful thinking is not a substitute for coolly rational analysis. And I'm reminded of a very sound remark by a very sound Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer, who said, "If you seek to make somebody your enemy, you will almost certainly succeed." As I said in London last month, this is no time for another long telegram or talk of containment. It makes no sense for America or Australia to base long-term strategy on the proposition that we are on an inevitable collision course with a militarily aggressive China. And yet, remarkably, while all of us galahs in the political or indeed foreign policy pet shop are talking about the rise of Asia, many are apparently labouring under the misapprehension that while everything can change in the economic balance of our region, nothing will change in strategic terms. In other words, even though China is about to become the world's largest economy and is actually in the centre of East Asia, nonetheless the United States will remain the dominant power in the region in the same way it has been since 1945 and even more so since the collapse of the USSR in 1991. Au contraire. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose is not a sound basis on which to build Australia's foreign policy. Rather, our strategic response to the rise of China should be to continue to deepen our engagement with that nation and with our other neighbours as friends, even if not as allies, and at the same time hedge against improbable but adverse future contingencies, as opposed to seeking to contain, futilely in all likelihood, a rising power. Of course, cool heads are required on all sides. China needs to be more transparent about its goals in the region, and on the basis of that build confidence with its neighbours so that misunderstandings can be avoided. In that light, the decision to host up to 2,500 Marines at an Australian Army base in Darwin could hardly be regarded as a threat to China, just as Australian naval vessels exercising with the People's Liberation Army Navy was presumably not regarded by the United States as a threat either. After all, there are over 60,000 American service personnel, including 17,000 Marines, in Japan and Korea, on China's doorstep, in comparison to Darwin. China's prickly reaction reflected not the foreshadowed deployment itself, but the context briefed out by the White House, that this was part of a strategy to stand up to growing Chinese economic and strategic power, a spin reflected in most media commentary despite being contrary to common sense, not to speak of geographic reality. It suits President Obama's domestic agenda to be seen to muscle up to China, even if the additional muscling does not bear too much analysis. But an Australian government needs to be careful not to allow a doe-eyed fascination with the leader of the free world to distract from the reality that our national interest requires us truly and not just rhetorically to maintain both an ally in Washington and a good friend in Beijing, which is after all our most important trading partner and a principal reason why our unemployment rate is half that of North America or Europe. If extravagant professions of loyalty and devotion to the United States strike a somewhat awkward note for many Australian ears, or indeed many American ears, how do we imagine they sound in the capitals of our neighbours? And the same may be said in respect of equally extravagant compliments paid to Beijing. Australian leaders should never forget that great powers regard deference as no more than their due. I've spoken about how certain strands of Australia's diplomatic and strategic stance, or at least the way they are presented, appear at odds with our interest in seeing the region in a fashion where there is no single hegemon, where stability is ensured by a power balance rather than a powerful enforcer. The transformation of our economy by the rise of emerging Asia surely underlines that point. Asia's growth has sparked a rapid expansion of global demand for food, minerals, energy and other raw materials, in many cases outstripping supply. And China's current stage of urbanisation and industrialisation is resource intensive, leading to large rises in the prices of the two commodities used to make steel, iron ore and coking coal, and the three burned for energy, crude oil, gas and thermal coal. Australia is a net importer of oil, but among the world's top exporters of the other four resources. Hence, the prices for our commodity exports are more than 3 times higher than in the 1980s and 90s, and the value of our yearly exports of minerals and energy have increased 4-fold in the past 8 years in Australian dollars. At the same time, global prices for manufactures have fallen, a consequence of production scale and efficiency in Asia, and these forces have interacted to push our terms of trade, which is the price of exports relative to our imports, to their highest in history, although it now appears a long expected easing is underway. Mid-2011 may have been the peak of the boom. So Asian growth has presented us with a huge windfall in national income. Since 2003, when the China boom became apparent, Australia's GDP is up 25%, but national income, which adjusts GDP to account for transfers to foreign investors and changes in our terms of trade, is up 42%. Now, the boom has been widely discussed, and I'll make 3 quick points about it in conclusion. The first is that in some ways Australia has little choice but to adjust to accommodate rising demand for resources. The return of China and India to the centre of the world economy is a powerful force, far beyond the control of a relatively small open market economy. As Paul Bloxham at HSBC has pointed out, all the $500 billion or more of approved or anticipated coal, iron ore and gas projects that will utterly reshape our economy over the next decade will only add up to about the amount of capital invested in China every 3 months. So it's rather deluded to believe we can protect uncompetitive industries, manage the exchange rate, or somehow stand loftily aside from the current global restructuring, which in any case has been extremely beneficial to us so far. My second point is that governments can, however, make decisions in areas such as workplace relations that impede or smooth the movement of labour and capital from one sector to another, and policies to smooth the current structural adjustment are urgently needed. Governments can also make policy choices that influence whether temporary income from the boom is saved or spent. The desirability of saving much of what may turn out to be a brief windfall is why I've advocated Australia create a new sovereign wealth fund or commit to renew deposits into our existing one. Perhaps most importantly of all, however, governments can invest in the education, the science and the research that will enable us to remain competitive in a converged world where the developed societies such as our own can no longer assume they have an advantage in technology or knowledge. Finally, Australians should not be complacent about the current outlook or the tremendous 20-year run of prosperity that past economic reforms and the rise of Asia have delivered to us. The irony of the 21st century resources boom is that it came after 2 decades of concerted effort to create a more flexible Australian economy capable of efficiently producing and exporting a more diverse range of goods and services, so reducing our dependency on commodities. Ross Garnaut has recently pointed out that the growth in China at least is likely to become increasingly productivity intensive and demand for bulk commodities may slow, particularly as urbanisation gets to that 60% level. China is at a point, or close to a point, where it will go from being an economy with an abundance of labour, a labour surplus, to a labour deficit. All of this will lead to rising incomes that will increase demand for more sophisticated products and services. We have to be equipped to take advantage of that. In terms of demand for commodities, Perhaps India and Indonesia will step into the breach when Chinese demand declines, but we shouldn't assume that. To conclude, the main challenges for Australian political leaders in responding to the rise of China and, in due course, India, are to combat complacency. Complacency in assuming the current resources windfall will persist forever, or that the strategic and diplomatic posture that served us in the past can and will serve us unchanged in the future, or that it doesn't matter if our economic and strategic messages to our region are somewhat contradictory. There are great opportunities for our nation in ever closer ties with Asia and the region's economic prosperity. But we will need thoughtful, nuanced, consistent and forward-looking policies to make the most of them. Thank you very much.